It had been a couple of months since Bill and Ben had started working at the container yard, and the twins had gotten used to the work there. It was a bit more varied than what they'd been doing at the China Clay Quarry, and they enjoyed getting to see a few of the other engines. Patrick, Peter and Bear were regular visitors to the container yard, and the twins got to know them well. Early one morning, the twins were shunting by the warehouse.
Bill, do you want to hear something interesting? What sort of something? Jeff just picked up a shipment of engine parts. What's interesting about that? They're probably just spares. Steam engine parts, Bill. Buffers and side rods. We've both heard those rumors going around.
Just after Gordon had returned from the works, rumours had started going around of a steam engine being built there. But both Jeff and the Fat Controller had been tight-lipped on the matter, as had Gordon.
You're probably right, Ben.
A moment later, Peter arrived with a container train from the mainland.
I'd better look after that train.
With that, Bill chuffed off. Ben continued to shunt. Henry was due in about 10 minutes, and he needed to have one of the warehouse tracks clear. Suddenly, a loud crash sounded out. The ground shook, then silence fell.
Bill, are you alright? Bill!
Ben looked over, worried. A moment later, the manager of the container yard came running up. Ben, you'd better come, quickly. There's been an accident. Ben quickly chuffed off, while the manager went to raise the alarm. Ben gasped, horrified, as the scene of the accident came into view. Bill was barely visible under a shipping container, which was buckled and dented.
Bill? Bill?
It's no good, Ben.
What happened?
Those flats on the other track were being unloaded. I don't know what caused it. The container just fell.
Before Peter could say any more, the manager ran over. I've raised the alarm. Diesel's bringing the breakdown train. Ben, we'll need you to clear those flats Peter brought in. Ben didn't reply, still stunned by what had happened. Ben?
Oh, of course.
Ben quickly moved off to help clear the tracks. A few hours later, the accident had been cleared up, and Peter had taken Bill to the works. Ben was waiting over by the goods shed. Investigators from the safety directorate had arrived, and the container yard had been shut down until they were done.
How are you doing, Ben?
Ben looked over to see the Fat Controller standing next to him. She was looking worried.
I'm not quite sure, Mom.
To be honest, Ben had been in a bit of a stunned daze since the accident.
I've spoken to the manager at the steamworks. They should have Bill back on his wheels in a couple of weeks.
Ben smiled weakly.
I'm glad to hear it.
I know it's fairly busy here. I can arrange for Sheffield to help with the work if you'd like.
He's that rude tank engine, isn't he?
He may be blunt, but he means well.
Ben paused for a moment. Sheffield and the twins had never really gotten on, and Ben didn't feel up to dealing with him right now.
I think I can handle it myself, Mom.
Okay.
The Fat Controller was on the verge of leaving when one of the inspectors strode up. Excuse me, Miss Hart. We're done with the scene of the accident, and you're clear to start operations again.
Thank you. Do you know what may have caused it?
I don't want to say too much at this stage, ma'am, but it looks like an undetected structural defect in the container may have caused one or more of the chains to separate when it was being lifted.
I see.
Looks like I should start handling the work then,
Ben said, and he chuffed off, slightly despondent. The Fat Controller watched him go, worried. Over the next few days, Ben managed to look after the work in the container yard. He had to work hard, and that kept his mind off Bill's absence. But that wasn't something that went completely unnoticed. There were moments when the little engine went to share a joke or observation with his twin, only to stop short when he realized he was on his own. Nights, however, were a different story. The goods shed, where the twins had been resting at night, had seemed rather small at first. But now, with only one engine occupying it. It seemed uncomfortably large and empty. One morning, 3 days after Bill's accident, Edward had just arrived at the container yard when Ben came alongside.
Morning, Ben.
Morning, Edward.
Are you alright, Ben?
I think so. It's just... I miss Bill. Not because it's busy, but...
Ben sighed.
It's a bit tricky to explain. I mean, we've always been together. I've never really been on my own like this.
I see. I can imagine it must be quite disorienting.
Yes.
I think I may know how you feel, Ben. When Henry had his accident with the flying kipper, we all missed him.
Thank you, Edward, but... You're used to working on your own. Being a single engine, I mean. Bill and I have always worked as a pair. We don't even need to tell each other what we've got in mind now.
Edward knew what Ben meant, having seen the twins in action over the years. He was about to speak again when a realization hit him. Despite all he'd learnt in the decades since he'd been built, this was something that was completely outside of Edward's experience.
I understand. If you do want to talk, Ben, I'm always willing to listen.
Ben smiled weakly.
Thank you, Edward.
Edward departed a moment later, still concerned. Despite their tendency to play jokes, Bill and Ben were good engines. He didn't like seeing either of them like this. He was still worrying about it a few hours later, when Douglas arrived at Wellsworth to collect some trucks. "Hello, Edward. I've been told you've got a shipment for me."
Yes, on that track over there.
A moment later, a thought struck Edward.
Douglas, would you mind if I asked you something personal?
"Not at all, Edward. What's on your mind?"
I know you and Donald are rather close. Do you two ever find yourselves thinking as one?
You mean that twin mind thing? Aye, on a few occasions. But not all the time, like Bill and Ben. That is where you were going with this, wasn't it? I heard about that nasty accident at the container yard.
Yes, I'm a bit worried about Ben,
Edward said, and he recounted his earlier conversation with Ben to Douglas. I understand where you're coming from, Edward. I'll make sure I get a chance to talk to the wee engine. Edward smiled.
Thank you, Douglas.
Dinna fash yourself, Douglas replied, and he chuffed off to collect his trucks. Later that evening, Ben was shunting in the container yard when he heard an engine approaching.
Track 3 should be free, James.
To his surprise, a different voice answered. Thank you, Ben. Douglas steamed in and stopped on the arrival track. Once the Scottish engine had brought his train to a halt, Ben looked over.
What brings you down here, Douglas? James usually brings this train in.
Aye, I stopped him for one of my return runs from Tidmouth to Alsborough.
What for?
I wanted to have a wee word with ye, Ben.
Oh?
Would I be right in saying that without Bill being here, you're feeling a wee bit incomplete?
More than a wee bit, Douglas. You know how it is.
Aye, Donald and I share that same bond you've got with Bill. We were built together, worked together, and we grew together. Just like you two, I'm presuming?
Yes, Bill was completed just 2 weeks before I was.
And that's what makes Donald and I twins too. He was completed just days before me. But we didn't always work together, you can. We were split up during the war, to look after trains where needed.
So you had to learn to work without each other?
Well, it wasn't the first time we'd been separated, just the longest. But I gather you've never had an experience like that?
No, not really. I mean, even when we were having maintenance done, that was in our shed at the China Clay Quarry.
I see. You know, this sort of thing may happen in the future. For example, say if one of you needs a major rebuild.
What?
Ben replied, slightly startled. He'd never even considered the possibility. Well, neither of you are getting any younger, Douglas pointed out. Ben's face fell.
But we always work together.
Aye, and I understand you're quite effective when you do. But you may need to get used to working apart, just every now and then.
Oh.
Dinna fash yourself, Ben. It strikes me that what you've got here is an opportunity to learn.
Yes.
Ben replied thoughtfully. Although he could see Douglas's point, he was still a bit doubtful. Anyway, I'm afraid I must be going, but do you think Bert would have told you? Douglas departed a moment later, and Ben watched him go, lost in thought. Over the next week and a half, Ben focused on his work in the container yard. Those moments of loneliness did still hit him, every now and then. But now, when that happened, he thought about what Douglas had told him. Although that didn't quite dispel Ben's feelings, it did help him cope with them. One afternoon, almost 2 weeks after Bill's accident, Ben was shunting some trucks in the container yard. Suddenly, a familiar whistle sounded out. Ben grinned as Bill steamed in, a train of empty container flat cars behind him.
I missed you!
Both twins laughed.
I'm glad to see you back in good health, Bill. How have you been? Over the last couple of weeks, I mean.
Of course, Bill immediately realized what his twin was getting at.
I did feel rather lonely, Ben. But I wasn't alone at the works, and I don't just mean Jeff.
Ben frowned, then remembered what they'd been discussing on the morning of the accident.
You mean those rumours are true? Not exactly. It's supposed to be a surprise. The Fat Controller asked me to keep it quiet.
Bill replied, shooting a meaningful look at Ben. Neither engine needed to say any more. They both grinned a moment later. Although they had grown a little during their time apart, it was good being back together.